What if I told you Sherlock Holmes solved the case perfectly, identified the murderer, understood the method, reconstructed every detail, and yet did absolutely nothing? Two men died of natural heart failure. No signs of struggle, no poison detected, no crime recorded, and yet a 7-year-old child had been avenged, 15 years too late. This is not a story about whether Sherlock Holmes could solve the mystery. This is the story of a case he solved, but could not stop. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. If you discovered that someone destroyed your child's life through carelessness, and the law did nothing, what would you do? Would you forgive? Would you forget? Or would you wait? Comment below. Where are you watching from? How old are you? And most importantly, do you believe revenge can ever be justice? I read your thoughts carefully here on Holmes' Deduction Diaries. Your insight matters, because this story will challenge it. Now, let us return to Baker Street. Chapter 1. The Physician's Widow. A stillness had settled upon 221B Baker Street that Tuesday morning. Not the comfortable silence of two men at rest, but the charged quiet of a mind at work behind a mask of indolence. I had returned from an early house call to find Sherlock Holmes seated at the breakfast table in his mouse-colored dressing gown, the remains of toast ignored at his elbow, his attention fixed upon the morning papers with an intensity I had learned never to interrupt carelessly. What struck me was not the reading itself, but its object. Holmes had bypassed the agony columns entirely. Before him lay the obituary pages of no fewer than 4 London dailies, and between his long fingers rested a pencil with which he had been circling entries, not randomly, but with the deliberate care of a taxonomist marking specimens for future study. 3 days now, I observed, settling into my chair opposite. Your powers of observation continue their steady ascent, Watson. The faintest trace of warmth softened the remark. Though it has been 4, if one counts Monday, when you were attending the Clarkson boys' croup. And what do you expect to find among the recently deceased? He set down the pencil and regarded me with those gray, penetrating eyes that could read a man's profession from his thumbnail and his guilt from his gait. A pattern, he said, or rather the absence of one. I have been following the death notices of London's medical professionals for reasons I cannot yet articulate to my own satisfaction. Something is wrong in the frequency, Watson. Something subtle, like a clock that loses only 1 second per hour, imperceptible in a day, ruinous over a year. I waited for elaboration. None came. Holmes merely returned to his columns, pencil poised, his brow carrying the faint contraction that signaled the earliest stage of a problem taking shape within that remarkable brain. I busied myself with the lancet and said nothing further. Long years beside this extraordinary man had taught me the virtue of patience in the presence of a gathering storm. Holmes would speak when the shape of the thing became clear to him. Until then, the pencil moved. The columns were marked, and beneath the calm surface of that quiet morning, something unseen had already begun. The knock, when it came shortly before 11, carried neither urgency nor hesitation. It was the measured knock of a person who had resolved upon a course of action and would not be deterred from it. 3 firm strikes, evenly spaced, followed by silence. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps crossed the hall below, and within moments the door to our sitting room opened to admit a woman whose bearing told me more than any calling card could have conveyed. She was perhaps 50 years of age, tall for a woman, and dressed in mourning of the most correct and somber variety. Not the ostentatious black of performative grief, but the careful, well-fitted garments of a woman for whom propriety was a form of armor. Her face, handsome rather than beautiful, bore the particular stillness I had observed in those who have recently passed through crisis and emerged on the far side of it with their composure intact, but their certainty shattered. "Mrs. Eleanor Ashgrove," Holmes said before she had spoken a single word. She paused. You know me, Mr. Holmes? I know your husband's obituary. It appeared in Tuesday's Times. Dr. Edwin Ashgrove, physician of Wimpole Street, dead at 53 of cardiac failure. The notice was written with professional restraint and personal grief in equal measure, which suggested a widow of education and discipline. Your mourning ring is recently sized, your gloves are new, but your bag is not, and you carry yourself with the particular composure of a woman who has spent decades in the company of medical men and has learned to discuss difficult subjects without flinching. He gestured toward the basket chair. Please sit. You have come about the letter. A flicker of surprise crossed her features, the first crack in that carefully maintained facade. How could you possibly know about the letter? I could not. But a woman who visits a consulting detective 4 days after her husband's death, when the coroner has already ruled that death natural, is not seeking an explanation for how he died. She is seeking something that was present before the death and absent after it. The most portable and concealable category of such objects is correspondence. Mrs. Ashgrove sat. She did not weep. She did not wring her hands or clutch at her handkerchief. She looked at Holmes with the steady gaze of a woman who had spent 4 days deciding whether to come and would not now waste the visit on theatrics. My husband died in his consulting room, she said. The door was locked from within. The coroner found nothing irregular. His colleagues have offered their condolences and their certainty. And yet, Mr. Holmes, the night before his death, Edwin sat in our drawing room holding a letter in hands that shook so badly he could not bring his teacup to his lips. I asked him what was wrong. He told me it was nothing. He was lying. And in the morning, the letter was gone. And by evening, so was he. Her voice did not break. But something behind her eyes, something older than 4 days of mourning, shifted like a shadow moving behind glass. The missing letter and Holmes's first observation. Holmes leaned forward with the particular quality of attention he reserved for details that others might dismiss. Not the broad strokes of a drama, but its punctuation. Describe the letter precisely, Mrs. Ashgrove. Not its contents, which you did not read, but its physical character. The envelope, the paper, any sensory detail you can recall, however trivial it may seem. She closed her eyes briefly, and I recognized the effort of a disciplined mind reaching past grief toward accuracy. Cream-colored stationery, good quality, not inexpensive, but not ostentatious. The envelope was of the same stock. I did not see a return address, and there was a scent. She paused. Lavender. Faint, but unmistakable. I noticed it when Edwin set the letter on the side table. The scent lingered after he took it away. Holmes's fingers steepled beneath his chin, that cathedral of thought I had witnessed 1,000 times. And this was not the first such letter? I cannot say with certainty, but I believe similar letters had arrived before. I recall the scent on previous occasions, once in autumn, once near Christmas. Edwin always collected the post himself. A physician who intercepts his own correspondence does so for one of 2 reasons, Holmes murmured, as if to himself. He is conducting an affair, or he is concealing a fear. Given your husband's age, reputation, and the evident stability of your household, I incline toward the latter. He turned his gaze fully upon her, and I saw something shift in his assessment, a deepening, a recalibration. Mrs. Ashgrove, you are wearing mourning, but you are also wearing guilt. Not the guilt of a woman who has done something wrong, but the guilt of a woman who suspects she failed to prevent something terrible. You visited a solicitor before coming here. The particular wear on your left glove suggests repeated handling of legal documents within the past 48 hours, and the clasp of your bag bears a scratch consistent with the brass fittings of chambers in Lincoln's Inn. She stiffened. I consulted a solicitor regarding Edwin's estate. There are irregularities in his accounts, monthly payments to an address I do not recognize, stretching back more than a year. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. The geometry of this quiet morning had acquired its first sharp angle. For a long moment after Mrs. Ashgrove finished speaking, Holmes said nothing. He rose from his chair and moved to the window where the morning light caught the angular planes of his face and rendered them almost architectural, a structure built for purpose rather than ornament. "I will take your case, Mrs. Ashgrove," he said at last, his back still turned. "Not because I believe your husband was murdered, that remains an open question, but because this matter possesses what I call a geometry of silence. Too many parties are content to let a death stand unexplained. The coroner is satisfied. The colleagues are satisfied. Even the solicitor, I suspect, counseled you to let the matter rest. He did. And yet you came to Baker Street. I came because silence is not the same as peace, Mr. Holmes." He turned from the window. Something in her final phrase had struck a resonance I could see register behind his eyes, a recognition not merely of her words, but of a principle he himself lived by. "No," he agreed quietly. "It is not." Mrs. Ashgrove departed with the restrained gratitude of a woman who understood that hope, offered prematurely, was its own cruelty. When the door had closed behind her and her footsteps had faded down the stairs, Holmes remained standing at the window, watching the street below. "An interesting woman," I offered. "An honest one," Holmes corrected, "which is considerably rarer and substantially more useful." He reached for his coat. "Come, Watson, Wimpole Street awaits, and bring your medical eye. I suspect we shall have need of it before this day is through." I reached for my hat, aware that the quiet Tuesday morning had ended and something altogether more demanding had taken its place. Chapter 2. The Consulting Room. Wimpole Street received us with the muted grandeur characteristic of London's medical quarter, a corridor of handsome Georgian facades, behind which the city's most distinguished physicians conducted the delicate commerce of health and reputation. Number 14 stood among its neighbors with quiet authority. Freshly painted railings, polished brass nameplate, window boxes still tended despite the household's bereavement. The public face of Dr. Edwin Ashgrove's life remained immaculate even in death. Holmes paused on the pavement opposite, surveying the building with the unhurried scrutiny he applied to crime scenes before crossing their thresholds. I had learned that these preliminary observations often yielded more than the formal inspection that followed. "Note the windows, Watson," he said. "The ground floor consulting room has curtains drawn. Expected, given the circumstances. But observe the first floor study. The curtains there are open, and I can see books displaced upon the shelves. Someone has been searching. Mrs. Ashgrove, perhaps? Looking for the letter? Perhaps. Or perhaps someone who arrived before her search began. A housemaid admitted us with the uncertain deference of staff, whose routines had been shattered by their master's death. The hallway smelled of beeswax and lilies, the latter arranged in a crystal vase on the side table, their funeral sweetness almost oppressive in the enclosed space. I noted the details of a prosperous medical household, the engraved consultation schedule still hanging beside the door, the umbrella stand containing 3 identical black umbrellas, the post stacked neatly on a silver tray, evidence of a life organized around precision and respectability, everything in its proper place, everything speaking of order. And yet, as we moved deeper into the house, I became aware of something less tangible, an atmosphere of suspended animation, as though the household had stopped not at the moment of Dr. Ashgrove's death, but at some earlier point, some unidentified moment when normalcy had first begun to fracture. Holmes noticed it too. I saw his nostrils flare slightly as we approached the consulting room door, not at any particular scent, but at the quality of the air itself, which carried the staleness of a room that had been sealed and avoided. "The lock," Holmes observed, running one finger along the doorframe. "Recently installed. Within the past 2 months, I should say. The brass is newer than the surrounding fixtures. A physician who locks himself inside his own consulting room. The question was not how Dr. Ashgrove died, but what he had been hiding from. The locked room examined. Mrs. Ashgrove had provided the spare key, and the consulting room door yielded with the reluctant click of a mechanism newly fitted and rarely used. The room beyond was precisely what one might expect of a Wimpole Street physician's professional sanctum. Leather-bound medical texts lining the walls, an examination table draped in clean linen, a mahogany desk positioned to face the door, and 2 patient chairs arranged at the angle of practiced consultation. But it was the fireplace that drew Holmes immediately. He crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt before the grate with the fluid economy of movement that characterized him when the scent of evidence was strong. I watched as he produced a small envelope from his coat pocket and, using a pair of tweezers, began extracting fragments of burned paper from among the ashes. "Someone burned correspondence here," he murmured. "And recently, within the past week, given the incomplete calcination of these fragments. But observe, Watson." He held up a charred corner between the tweezers. "This paper is not cream-colored. It is white, of a heavier stock. Professional stationery, I should say. Whatever Mrs. Ashgrove's husband burned in this grate was not the lavender-scented letter she described. It was something older." He set the fragments aside with care and turned his attention to the desk. The surface was largely clear. A blotter, an inkstand, a prescription pad. But Holmes tilted the blotter toward the window light at a shallow angle and studied its surface with the concentration of a man reading scripture. "There," he said softly, "an impression, the last thing written upon paper resting on this blotter." He adjusted the angle incrementally. "I can make out only a partial phrase, Watson." The pressure was uneven. The hand that wrote it was not steady. "What does it say?" Holmes was silent for a moment, his gray eyes narrowed against the oblique light. "The child deserved better." The words hung in the still air of that sealed room like an accusation that had outlived the voice that uttered it. I felt something shift beneath the surface of this investigation. A tremor, faint but unmistakable, suggesting depths we had not yet begun to fathom. Holmes straightened and surveyed the room once more, but I could see that his attention had turned inward. The locked door, the burned papers, the trembling hand, the missing letter, and now these 5 words pressed into a blotter by a dead man's guilt. They were not the elements of a simple domestic puzzle. They were the visible edges of something that had been buried for a very long time. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "I believe we are not investigating a death. We are excavating one." Holmes produced the coroner's report from his inner pocket, obtained, I suspected, through channels I had long since ceased to question, and handed it to me without comment. I understood my role. In matters of criminal deduction, I was Holmes's student. In matters of medicine, I was his authority, and he had the rare grace to acknowledge the distinction without ceremony. I read the report carefully, standing beside the window where the light was strongest. The findings were straightforward. Dr. Edwin Ashgrove, aged 53, cause of death cardiac arrest consistent with long-standing arterial disease. No external injuries, no signs of struggle. Stomach contents unremarkable, heart enlarged, case closed. And yet, "Holmes," I said slowly, "the pupillary observations trouble me." "Go on." The report notes bilateral pupil dilation at the time of examination. In simple cardiac failure, one would expect the pupils to be normal or constricted, depending on the stage of collapse. This degree of dilation is more consistent with certain toxic agents, digitalis chief among them. An overdose would produce precisely this presentation while simultaneously inducing the cardiac arrest that killed him. Holmes regarded me steadily. Could a physician administer such a dose to himself? The question carried weight beyond its clinical simplicity. I considered it with the seriousness it deserved. Yes, A physician would know the precise quantity required and the method of administration. Digitalis is readily available in any medical practice. It would be virtually undetectable in a post-mortem examination unless specifically sought, and in a case ruled natural by a coroner already satisfied with the obvious explanation, it would not be sought. Then we have two possibilities, Holmes said. Self-administration born of despair, or administration by another hand disguised as nature. Both are terrible, I replied. Yes, Holmes agreed. And both begin with the same question. What was the child's name? Mrs. Calder, the Ashgrove housekeeper, was a sturdy woman of 60 whose loyalty to the household expressed itself in protective reticence. She met Holmes's questions with the wariness of a sentry who suspects the approaching figure may be friendly but cannot yet confirm it. Holmes approached her with a gentleness that might have surprised those who knew only his public reputation for cold precision. He asked about routines, about the doctor's habits in recent months, about small changes that others might overlook. It was this last question that unlocked her. There was a woman, Mrs. Calder said, lowering her voice as though the walls retained the capacity for judgment. 3 evenings before the doctor died, she came without appointment, middle-aged, plainly dressed, not a patient I had ever seen. She stayed no more than 10 minutes. When she left, the doctor was gray. Gray as that sky, sir. He would not take supper. And the letters? Cream-colored envelopes. They came monthly, regular as the gas bill. I assumed they were from a patient. The doctor had many who wrote to him. But these he always took himself, directly from the tray. And afterward he was always quiet. A particular kind of quiet. What kind? She hesitated. The kind where a person is listening to something no one else can hear. Holmes thanked her with a warmth that was neither performed nor perfunctory, and she withdrew. Lavender, I said. Yes, Watson, Holmes replied, his voice carrying the measured gravity of a man who has found the thread he sought and understands already that it leads somewhere dark. Lavender, and a grief that arrives on schedule. Chapter 3. The Reputation of Dr. Ashgrove. Holmes dispatched me to the Royal College of Physicians with instructions that were characteristically precise in their vagueness. Ask about Ashgrove, not what he achieved. Any directory can furnish that, but what his colleagues choose not to say. The silences between compliments are where the truth resides, Watson. I arrived at the college shortly after luncheon and was received with the professional courtesy extended to any fellow medical man making respectful inquiry about a recently deceased colleague. The portrait that emerged from 3 separate conversations was remarkably consistent. Dr. Edwin Ashgrove had been a credit to his profession. His published work on pediatric cardiac conditions was widely respected. His charitable clinic in Bermondsey served the poor with a dedication that exceeded mere obligation. He was, by all accounts, a man whose public life embodied the highest ideals of medicine. It was during my conversation with Dr. Philip Fenton, a surgeon of perhaps 60 who had known Ashgrove since their student days, that the surface first showed its crack. Fenton spoke generously of Ashgrove's later career, the publications, the consultancies, the quiet philanthropy. But when I inquired about Ashgrove's early years, specifically his time in general practice before establishing himself in Wimpole Street, Fenton's fluency faltered. He reached for his tea with a hand that was not quite steady. His early career was unremarkable, Fenton said. He held a partnership in Stepney, I believe, a general practice. He left to pursue specialist work. It is a common enough trajectory. And the circumstances of his departure? Fenton set down his cup. I am not certain I recall the specifics. It was a long time ago. These things, partnerships dissolve for many reasons. Professional differences, divergent ambitions. He met my eyes as he said this, and what I saw there was not ignorance, but the particular discomfort of a man maintaining a boundary he had long ago agreed to respect. The medical profession guards its own with a solidarity that I, as a member of that profession, understood intimately, and that understanding made the evasion all the more troubling. I pressed no further. Holmes had taught me that the shape of a refusal often reveals more than the content of an answer, and Dr. Fenton's careful circumnavigation of Ashgrove's early career had the unmistakable contour of a man steering around something he did not wish to strike. I returned to Baker Street with a name unsullied and a silence that spoke volumes, and I found Holmes waiting with a document that would give that silence its voice. Holmes had spent the afternoon among the public records at Somerset House, that great Victorian repository where the vital statistics of the nation, its births, its marriages, its deaths, were catalogued with bureaucratic thoroughness. It was a resource Holmes employed frequently, for he understood that the most revealing narratives were often written not in letters or diaries, but in the cold, factual entries of official registers. He had spread his findings upon the table at Baker Street by the time I returned, and the arrangement of documents told me, even before he spoke, that he had found something of consequence. Holmes never arranged evidence carelessly. When papers were spread, it meant connections were being drawn. When they were stacked, conclusions had been reached. These were spread. Dr. Edwin Ashgrove departed his partnership at a general practice in Stepney in the spring of 1880. Holmes began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man laying bricks in a precise wall. He was the junior partner. The senior was a Dr. Josiah Hartwell, who remains in practice in the East End to this day, though in considerably diminished circumstances, as we shall discuss. And the cause of the departure? Officially, professional divergence, precisely the phrase your Dr. Fenton employed, which suggests a coordinated narrative rather than independent recollection. But observe this. He slid a document toward me. In March of 1880, a child named Clara Melling, aged 7, died of cardiac failure while under treatment at the Stepney practice. The death certificate was signed by Dr. Josiah Hartwell. Not Ashgrove? No. Hartwell, as senior partner, bore the formal responsibility. But the treatment records, which are a matter of public health documentation for a practice serving the poor, indicate that Clara Melling's attending physician was the junior partner. Ashgrove. I stared at the death certificate. Clara Melling, 7 years old, cardiac failure. The same cause of death, I said quietly. Precisely, Watson. A child dies of heart failure under Ashgrove's care in 1880. Ashgrove himself dies of heart failure in 1895. 15 years apart, the same clinical language, and between them, cream-colored letters that smell of lavender. He gathered the papers with the careful hands of a man who understood that documents were not merely records, but echoes, and that some echoes carried across decades with undimmed force. The evening had drawn close around Baker Street by the time Holmes completed his account, and Mrs. Hudson's lamp cast a steady amber glow across the table where the documents of 2 deaths, separated by 15 years but joined by a thread we were only beginning to trace, lay arranged with the precision of a cartographer's survey. I confess I resisted the connection Holmes was drawing, not from obtuseness, I hope, but from the professional instinct of a medical man who understood how readily coincidence could be mistaken for causation. Holmes, I said carefully, cardiac failure is among the most common causes of death in London. That 2 individuals connected to the same practice should die of similar complaints 15 years apart may be nothing more than statistical inevitability. You are correct in principle, Holmes replied, and I noted with appreciation that he did not dismiss my objection but engaged it directly. Coincidence is the refuge of the unimaginative, but it is also, on occasion, the truth. I do not yet claim that these deaths are connected by anything more than circumstance. But consider the additional elements. The cream-colored letters arriving monthly for over a year, carrying the scent of lavender. The mysterious woman who visited Ashgrove 3 days before his death and left him shattered. The phrase pressed into his blotter, "The child deserved better." And the monthly payments from Ashgrove's accounts to an address his widow does not recognize. He paused and met my gaze across the lamplight. Circumstance is merely causality observed from an insufficient distance, Watson. We must close that distance, and to do so, I require you to locate the present address of one Margaret Melling, mother of Clara Melling, who died at the age of 7 in a Stepney consulting room and who, I increasingly suspect, has never been forgotten by anyone involved in her death. I agreed, though something in the name, Margaret Melling, settled into my awareness with the weight of a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward toward shores I could not yet see. Chapter 4. The Mother's Shadow. My inquiries into the life of Margaret Melling occupied the better part of the following morning, and yielded a portrait so modest in its dimensions that it seemed, at first, to contradict every suspicion Holmes had begun to form. Here was no shadowy figure of vengeance, no calculating adversary moving pieces across a board of retribution. Here, by every outward measure, was simply a woman whom life had diminished. Through parish records, a cooperative clerk at the Camberwell registration office, and a brief conversation with a district nurse who recalled the family, I assembled the following. Margaret Melling, née Poole, aged 52, resided in lodgings at No. 11 Cold Harbor Lane, Camberwell. She earned her living as a seamstress, taking in piecework from a dressmaker in Walworth Road. Her husband, Thomas Melling, a dock worker of decent reputation and modest means, had died of consumption in 1888, 8 years after their daughter. She had no other children. She attended St. Giles's Church with regularity. She had no criminal record, no known associations of concern, and no history of complaint or dispute with any neighbor or employer. I presented this to Holmes with the quiet confidence of a man delivering evidence that surely mitigated against the theory of an elaborate, patient conspiracy. Holmes listened without interruption, his pipe held motionless in his right hand, his eyes fixed upon some middle distance visible only to himself. "You describe an ordinary life, Watson," he said when I had finished. "I do. And yet consider what that ordinary life contains. A daughter dead through medical negligence, a husband dead through disease, no children to console, no family to sustain, no wealth to distract. Only work and church and the long, quiet evenings of a woman who has been given ample time and ample reason to think." He rose and reached for his coat. "The most dangerous architectures in this world are not built by men of action, Watson. They are built by patient hands with nothing left to lose and nothing left to love except a memory. Ordinariness, in such circumstances, is not the absence of purpose. It is the most meticulous disguise imaginable. We set out for Camberwell within the hour, and I carried with me, despite my reservations, the uncomfortable awareness that Holmes's reading of Margaret Melling's life might be the truer one. The visit to Camberwell. Cold Harbor Lane in Camberwell was neither squalid nor prosperous. It occupied that vast middle territory of London life where respectability was maintained through effort rather than abundance, and where the line between managing and failing was as thin as the cotton curtains that hung in every window. No. 11 was a narrow terraced house divided into lodgings, its front steps scrubbed clean, its window glass polished to a clarity that spoke of stubborn domestic pride. Margaret Melling answered the door herself. She was a small woman, neatly dressed in dark gray, with hands roughened by needlework, and eyes that held the particular quality of watchfulness I had observed in soldiers who had seen prolonged action. Not fearful, but perpetually alert, as though the world had long ago demonstrated its capacity for sudden cruelty, and she had resolved never to be caught unprepared again. Holmes introduced us with a gentleness that might have astonished Inspector Lestrade. He did not present his card, did not invoke his reputation, did not explain the nature of our inquiry with the brisk efficiency he employed with reluctant witnesses. Instead, he asked simply whether she might spare us a few minutes of her time, and something in his tone, a quality of respect that went beyond mere courtesy, caused her to step aside and admit us without question. Her rooms were small but immaculate. A sewing table stood beneath the window, positioned to catch the maximum light. A shelf held a modest collection of books, devotional texts, a volume of poetry, a botanical guide. The air carried a faint, unmistakable scent, lavender. Not perfume, but the natural oil derived from the plant itself, clean and precise and lingering. Holmes did not remark upon it. He did not glance at the writing desk, where cream-colored stationery sat in a neat stack beside a small brown bottle. He did not survey the room with his customary rapid inventory of telling details. Instead, he sat in the chair she offered and asked about Clara. And Margaret Melling, who had admitted two strangers into her home without explanation, began to speak of her daughter with a love so steady and so undimmed by 15 years of absence that I felt my throat tighten despite myself. She described a bright child, small for her age, with a weakness of the heart that had been present from birth. She spoke of the hopes placed in a new treatment recommended by the doctor at the Stepney practice, a course of medication that was meant to strengthen the faltering organ. She described the night Clara stopped breathing, simply and without elaboration, as one describes a fact that has been lived with so long it has become as permanent as geography. Holmes listened with a stillness I had rarely witnessed in him. Not the coiled stillness of analytical attention, but something quieter, the stillness of a man in the presence of a grief that his formidable intellect could neither reduce nor resolve. It was only as we prepared to take our leave that I became aware of what Holmes had surely noticed from the first moment of the conversation, the careful, systematic omission at its center. Margaret Melling had spoken of her daughter with extraordinary clarity and tenderness. She had described Clara's condition, the treatment, the night of her death, and the long aftermath of mourning with the precision of a woman who had relived these events 10,000 times in the theater of her own memory. But in the entire account, she had never once named the physician who treated Clara. She spoke of the doctor and the treatment and the practice in Stepney, but the name Ashgrove had not crossed her lips, nor had Hartwell's. The omission was so consistent, so thoroughly maintained, that it could not have been accidental. It was a boundary, carefully constructed and rigorously defended, the boundary of a woman who had decided long ago precisely what she would and would not say aloud. Holmes, for his part, had not pressed her. He had not asked the physician's name, had not steered the conversation toward Ashgrove or Hartwell or the circumstances of Clara's treatment. He had listened, observed, and allowed the shape of what was absent to speak as eloquently as what was present. As we descended the narrow stairs and emerged into the gray Camberwell afternoon, I remarked that I had found Margaret Melling sympathetic and truthful. Sympathetic, certainly, Holmes agreed, turning up his collar against the chill, and her truthfulness was the most carefully constructed thing in the room. You believe she was lying? I believe she was doing something considerably more sophisticated than lying, Watson. She was telling the truth selectively, offering everything that was genuine and withholding everything that was dangerous. It is a far more difficult art than simple deception, and she practiced it with the fluency of long experience. He paused at the corner and glanced back toward number 11 Cold Harbor Lane, where the polished windows reflected nothing but the overcast sky. "The lavender," he said, "the stationery, and a woman who speaks of everything except the one name that matters." That evening at Baker Street, a change settled over Holmes that I had rarely witnessed in all our years of association. He sat in his customary chair, pipe in hand, but the pipe remained unlit, held not as an instrument of thought, but as an anchor, something solid to grasp, while the currents of reflection pulled at him. I had seen Holmes restless. I had seen him elated, consumed, and bitterly frustrated. But this was different. This was something closer to a somber respect, the recognition of an intelligence operating on principles entirely different from his own, yet no less formidable. "We are not investigating a murder in the conventional sense, Watson," he said at last, his voice carrying the quiet weight of a conclusion reached reluctantly and accepted without illusion. "Then what are we investigating?" "The final act of something that began 15 years ago. A design so patient, so meticulously conceived, that by the time it became visible to anyone outside its architect's mind, it was already nearing completion." He turned the unlit pipe slowly between his fingers. "I fear we are already too late to alter its conclusion." "Too late for whom?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. The fire crackled softly in the grate, and the sounds of Baker Street at evening, the distant rattle of hansom cabs, the murmur of pedestrians, filtered through the windows like the pulse of a city unaware of the quiet reckoning taking place within its walls. When he finally spoke, his answer was not the one I expected. "For everyone." Morning brought with it a sense of acceleration, not the frantic haste of a case unraveling, but the measured quickening of a narrative whose internal clock Holmes had begun to perceive, and whose remaining hours he estimated with growing concern. He was dressed and ready before I had finished my breakfast, and by 9 o'clock we were in a hansom bound for Whitechapel. Dr. Josiah Hartwell maintained his practice in a narrow building on Commercial Road, wedged between a pawnbroker and a chandler's shop. The contrast with Ashgrove's Wimpole Street premises could not have been more stark. Where Ashgrove's world had been polished brass and Georgian symmetry, Hartwell's was peeling paint and the persistent smell of carbolic soap fighting a losing battle against the deeper odors of poverty and neglect. The man himself received us in a consulting room that bore the marks of professional decline with painful clarity. The instruments on his tray were serviceable but old. The medical texts on his shelves were editions long superseded. A bottle of whiskey stood on the windowsill with the unapologetic frankness of a companion that had ceased to be occasional. Hartwell was perhaps 58, hollow-eyed, with the sallow complexion of a man whose sleep was insufficient and whose conscience was overtaxed. His hands, when he extended one in greeting, trembled, and I noted, with the clinical eye Holmes had asked me to bring, that the tremor was not uniform. It was worst in the right hand, consistent not merely with alcoholic neuropathy, but with the chronic tension of sustained, unrelenting anxiety. "Dr. Hartwell," Holmes said, settling into the patient's chair with the ease of a man who understood that the most effective interrogations began by conceding the position of supplicant. "I come to you regarding your former partner, Dr. Edwin Ashgrove." The effect was immediate. Hartwell's already pale face lost what remained of its color, and his right hand, the trembling one, moved involuntarily to his desk drawer, as though reaching for something that might protect him. "Ashgrove is dead," he said. "Indeed, and I believe you know why." Holmes held his gaze. Between these two men, the detective and the doctor, there passed a recognition as old as guilt itself. The understanding that concealment had reached its limit, and that the next word spoken would determine everything. The confession, when it came, did not arrive as a flood. It came in fragments, halting, reluctant, extracted not by Holmes's questions but by the sheer accumulated pressure of 15 years of silence, finally finding a crack through which to escape. Hartwell spoke as a man dismantles his own scaffold, plank by plank, knowing that each piece removed brings him closer to the ground. "It was March of 1880, he began, his voice carrying the roughened quality of words long rehearsed in private, but never spoken aloud. "We were overworked. The practice served half of Stepney, and there were only the two of us. Ashgrove was young, brilliant, dedicated, but exhausted. He had been working 18-hour days for weeks." "And the child?" Holmes prompted gently. "Clara Melling, 7 years old, a congenital weakness of the heart manageable with proper treatment. The protocol required a precise dosage of digitalis, carefully calibrated to her weight and condition. It was Ashgrove's case. He calculated the dosage. Hartwell paused. His hands, both trembling now, gripped the edge of the desk. He made an error, a simple, terrible arithmetic error, the kind that exhaustion breeds and vigilance prevents. The dose he administered was nearly 3 times the correct amount. By the time the symptoms manifested, it was too late. The child died that night. The room was very quiet. Through the thin walls, I could hear the sounds of Commercial Road, the cries of vendors, the rumble of carts, a world continuing its business in cheerful ignorance of the confession unfolding within this cramped, diminished surgery. "And you?" Holmes asked. "I was the senior partner. I signed the death certificate. Cardiac failure secondary to congenital defect," which was true as far as it went. The digitalis overdose precipitated the arrest, but the underlying condition was real. I told myself I was recording the root cause rather than the proximate one. It was a distinction that satisfied the coroner and destroyed my sleep for 15 years. And Ashgrove? Edwin left the practice within the month. He could not bear to remain. He threw himself into specialist work, pediatric cardiology, of all things, as though he could atone for one dead child by saving 1,000 others. Perhaps he did. I do not know. We never spoke of Clara Melling again. Not once, in 15 years. Yet someone else spoke of her, Holmes said. Hartwell looked up, and in his eyes I saw not surprise but the weary recognition of a man who has long expected the knock at the door and is almost relieved to hear it at last. "The letters," he whispered. "You know about the letters." "I know about the letters," Holmes confirmed. "Tell me everything." Hartwell reached for the whiskey bottle, and this time I did not judge him for it. There are confessions that require fortification, and his was not yet complete. The letters began. Hartwell drank once, briefly, and continued with the mechanical determination of a man who understood that stopping now would mean never finishing. They began approximately 14 months ago. Cream-colored envelopes, good quality stationery, posted from various locations in South London. No return address, no signature, and no explicit demand of any kind. "Describe their contents," Holmes said. "Facts, simply facts." Each letter contained a specific detail about Clara Melling's treatment and death, the date of her first appointment, the prescribed medication, the dosage Ashgrove calculated, the correct dosage that should have been administered, the time of death, the wording of the death certificate. Each letter presented one detail, calmly and accurately, as though reciting entries from a medical chart. "Nothing more?" "Nothing more was necessary, Mr. Holmes." Hartwell's voice cracked for the first time. Each letter was a mirror held up to the worst moment of my life. No threat was required. No demand for money appeared anywhere in the correspondence. The letter simply said, "I know what happened. I remember every detail, and I will continue to remember month after month for as long as I choose." "Yet you sent money," Holmes observed. Hartwell nodded, shame and exhaustion competing for dominance across his ravaged features. "I began sending payments to a post office box in Camberwell, £5 monthly, which is more than I could afford and less than I felt I owed. No one asked me to. No one acknowledged receipt. I simply needed to do something." The silence of those letters was unbearable. Paying felt like dialogue, even though it was entirely one-sided. "And Ashgrove?" "I assume he did the same, though we never discussed it. We never discussed anything. After he left the practice, we maintained no contact whatsoever. The letters were the only thread connecting us, and even that thread was invisible. I did not know he received them until I read his obituary and understood, with a certainty that required no deduction, that he had been receiving them too." Holmes was quiet for a moment, his expression carrying the focused gravity of a man watching the final pieces of a mechanism settle into alignment. Blackmail conducted entirely through memory, he murmured. No threats, no demands, only the relentless, patient repetition of truth, delivered to men whose guilt made them unable to distinguish between reminder and accusation. Hartwell said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Holmes identifies the pattern. We departed Hartwell's surgery in silence, and Holmes did not speak until we had walked some distance along Commercial Road, leaving behind the cramped misery of that diminished practice for the broader, noisier anonymity of the Whitechapel streets. "She never committed a crime, Watson," Holmes said at last. "That is the extraordinary precision of it. Margaret Melling, if indeed she is our correspondent, never threatened, never demanded, never extorted. She simply reminded two men of what they had done, month after month, and allowed the weight of their own consciences to exact whatever payment they saw fit to offer. But the effect was devastating," I protested. "Hartwell is a ruined man. Hartwell ruined himself in 1880 when he signed a fraudulent death certificate. The letters merely prevented him from forgetting that fact. There is a distinction between causing a wound and preventing it from healing, and it is in that distinction that Margaret Melling has constructed her entire campaign." I struggled with this. The physician in me recognized the suffering I had witnessed in Hartwell's trembling hands and hollow eyes. The moral philosopher in me, such as he was, understood that the suffering had its origin not in the letters, but in the act they commemorated. "She found a weapon more powerful than any threat," Holmes continued, his voice carrying a note I could only describe as reluctant admiration. "The truth itself, delivered with patience and without mercy." We walked on. The afternoon was gray and indifferent, and somewhere in Camberwell, cream-colored stationery waited in a neat stack beside a bottle of lavender oil. It was as we turned onto Baker Street, the gaslight beginning to flicker against the early dusk, that the architecture of the case revealed its most urgent dimension to Holmes. He stopped mid-stride, and I saw the color shift in his expression, the analytical calm replaced by something sharper, more immediate. "Watson, if Ashgrove is dead, whether by his own hand, by accumulated physiological strain, or by more deliberate means, then the pattern has not concluded. It has merely completed its first movement." "You mean Hartwell?" "I mean that we have identified a sequence, the monthly letters establishing psychological pressure over 14 months, followed by a personal visit, the mysterious woman Mrs. Calder described, followed by death. If this sequence was applied to Ashgrove, there is no reason to believe it was not simultaneously applied to Hartwell." The urgency in his voice was controlled but unmistakable. "We must return to Whitechapel immediately. If Hartwell has received a visit comparable to the one that preceded Ashgrove's death, then we may have very little time." We had scarcely reached our rooms and gathered our coats when Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door with a telegram on her tray. Holmes took it, read it, and set it down on the table with the careful, deliberate motion of a man placing the final stone upon a cairn. "Inspector Lestrade," he said quietly, "Dr. Josiah Hartwell has been found dead in his surgery. Apparent heart failure." The telegram lay between us like a verdict. "We are too late," I said. Holmes did not contradict me. Chapter 6. The Second Body. We arrived at Hartwell's surgery within the hour to find the narrow street already occupied by the familiar apparatus of official inquiry. A police constable at the door, a mortuary van waiting at the curb, and Inspector Lestrade standing in the hallway with his notebook open and his expression fixed in the particular combination of competence and irritation that characterized his engagement with cases he considered straightforward. "Holmes," he said, with the clipped greeting of a man who had not requested assistance and was not entirely pleased to receive it. "And Dr. Watson, I might have known. Word travels fast in your circles." "Word travels at the speed of telegram, Lestrade," which is considerably faster than circumstance. Holmes moved past him toward the consulting room with the quiet authority that even Lestrade, after years of reluctant collaboration, no longer attempted to obstruct. The scene within was a grim echo of the one we had examined at Wimpole Street, translated from prosperity into poverty, but carrying the same essential signature. Hartwell sat slumped forward across his desk, his right cheek resting upon the blotter, his arms extended as though he had been reaching for something when the final arrest seized his heart. The whiskey bottle stood at his elbow, half empty. A glass, recently used, sat beside it. But it was the scent that arrested my attention first, beneath the whiskey, beneath the carbolic, beneath the general staleness of the room. There lingered something fainter and entirely incongruous. Lavender, clean, deliberate, and unmistakable. And there, beside the body, positioned with a precision that suggested it had been placed rather than merely left, was a cream-colored envelope, opened, its contents still visible within. Holmes examined the scene with meticulous, unhurried care. The position of the body, the angle of the arms, the state of the desk, the placement of every object within reach. I watched him work with the concentrated attention of a man who understood that this room contained not merely a corpse, but a communication, and that every element had been arranged to say something specific. Lestrade, meanwhile, had arrived at his conclusion with characteristic efficiency. "Heart failure," he announced. "Same as Ashgrove, if you ask me. These medical men work themselves to the bone and wonder why the engine gives out. I've seen 3 similar cases this year alone." I knelt beside Hartwell's body and conducted my own brief examination, gently lifting one eyelid and then the other. The pupils were dilated, widely and bilaterally, precisely as the coroner's report had described in Ashgrove's case. 2 identical presentations, 15 years after an identical crime. "Lestrade," I said carefully, "I should like to recommend a more thorough toxicological examination than the standard post-mortem provides." "On what grounds, Doctor?" I glanced at Holmes, who gave the faintest shake of his head. "Not yet. Not here." "Professional thoroughness," I replied. "Nothing more." Holmes withdrew the letter from its cream-colored envelope with the reverence one might accord a historical document, which, in a sense, it was. The history it recorded was private rather than public, but no less consequential for its obscurity. He read it in silence, then read it again. I watched his face for the subtle indicators I had learned to interpret over years of close observation. The slight narrowing of the eyes that signaled recognition, the fractional tightening of the jaw that accompanied moral complexity, the brief stillness of the hands that meant the analytical mind had encountered something that engaged not only its logic, but its conscience. "This letter is different from the others Hartwell described," Holmes said at last. "The previous correspondence contained only facts, dates, dosages, clinical details. This is a closing statement." He held the letter toward the lamplight, and though I could not read its contents from where I stood, I could see that the handwriting was steady, unhurried, and graceful, the script of a woman who had taken her time, who had perhaps composed many drafts before arriving at the version she deemed worthy of serving as a final word. Holmes read aloud, his voice carrying the measured gravity appropriate to another person's most considered thoughts. "I waited 15 years for one of you to speak, to confess, to apologize, to acknowledge even privately, even in a whisper, the life you carelessly extinguished and then buried beneath paperwork and professional courtesy. Neither of you ever did. Your silence, maintained this long, has become its own confession. I have nothing more to say to men who had nothing to say to me." There was no signature. At the bottom of the page, pressed flat and still faintly fragrant, lay a single sprig of dried lavender. Holmes replaced the letter in its envelope with care. "She has finished," he said quietly. "Whatever Margaret Melling set in motion 14 months ago, this letter represents its conclusion. The correspondence is closed. The account in her mind is settled. And 2 men are dead, I said. Yes, Holmes replied, and a 7-year-old girl is still dead, and has been for 15 years without anyone being called to account for it, until now. The lavender lay between the pages like a pressed flower in a book of remembrance, beautiful and terrible and perfectly preserved. Lestrade joined us in the consulting room, his notebook filled with the efficient shorthand of a man cataloging facts he considered self-explanatory. He surveyed the scene with the professional satisfaction of a puzzle already solved. Natural causes, he said. Heart failure, same as the coroner will find. 2 physicians dead of the same complaint within a week. Unusual, perhaps, but hardly suspicious. Medical men are notoriously poor custodians of their own health. Holmes regarded him with the patience he reserved for conclusions he intended to challenge without alienating their author. Lestrade, I should like to propose an alternative reading of these events. Both men died not of natural cardiac failure, but of digitalis poisoning. The same substance administered in carefully calibrated doses over an extended period, which would produce symptoms indistinguishable from natural heart disease. The method would be virtually undetectable in a standard post-mortem examination. Lestrade's expression shifted from satisfaction to skepticism. Digitalis poisoning, and your evidence? The pupillary dilation observed in both cases, inconsistent with simple cardiac arrest. The cream-colored correspondence both men received for over a year, designed to maintain psychological pressure. The monthly payments from Ashgrove's accounts to an untraceable post office box, the mysterious visitor who preceded Ashgrove's death, and the final letter found beside this body, which reads as a closing statement from an individual who considered their work complete. That is theory, Mr. Holmes, theory and coincidence. It would not survive 5 minutes before a magistrate. I am aware of that, Holmes said, and the quietness of his admission surprised me more than any declaration of certainty would have. I am telling you what happened. I cannot yet prove it to the standard the law requires, and I am not certain I ever shall be able to. The fault line between Holmes's intellectual certainty and the law's evidentiary demands had opened, and neither man could bridge it. Lestrade departed with his notebook and his conclusions. Holmes remained with his and found no satisfaction in the difference. The Whitechapel streets received us with their customary indifference. The noise, the commerce, the dense weave of lives being conducted at volumes and velocities that admitted no pause for philosophical reflection. Holmes walked briskly, his hands clasped behind his back, and I matched his pace in silence for some minutes before the pressure of my own thoughts demanded expression. I find myself divided, Holmes, I confessed. As a physician, I am appalled. If Margaret Melling administered digitalis to these men, through whatever means, she committed murder, regardless of her motive. The taking of life through medical knowledge perverted to lethal purpose is an abomination against everything my profession holds sacred. I paused, aware that the sentence I was about to speak contradicted the one I had just completed. And yet, as a man, simply as a human being who has heard a mother speak of her dead child, I understand a grief that outlasts all reason. I understand the rage that silence breeds when justice fails. I cannot condone what she may have done, but I cannot pretend that I do not comprehend why she did it. Holmes listened without interruption, and when he replied, his voice carried none of the analytical detachment I might have expected. Understanding motive is not the same as forgiving method, Watson. Our task is not to judge Margaret Melling. It is to determine, with as much precision as the evidence permits, what she has done. His voice was calm, measured, and entirely without the note of moral superiority that lesser minds might have employed. I noted this and was grateful for it. Chapter 7. The Instrument of Patience. Holmes spent the following morning in consultation with Pemberton's toxicological reference and a monograph on cardiac glycosides that he had obtained through channels I did not inquire about, from the library of St. Bartholomew's Hospital. I sat across from him, attending to my own medical texts, but my attention was drawn repeatedly to the quiet intensity with which he worked. Not the feverish energy of a man racing toward a solution, but the steady, methodical progression of a mind confirming what it already suspected. "The mechanism is elegant in its simplicity," he said at last, closing the monograph with a careful hand. "Digitalis, derived from the common foxglove, is among the most widely prescribed cardiac medications in modern practice. In therapeutic doses, it strengthens the failing heart. In excessive doses, it stops the heart entirely. And here is the critical point, Watson. A single dramatic overdose would produce detectable symptoms in a post-mortem examination. But chronic administration of slightly elevated doses, gradually increased over weeks or months, would erode cardiac function so gradually that the eventual failure would appear entirely natural. It would require considerable knowledge, I observed. Knowledge, yes, but not necessarily medical training. The information is available in any competent herbal guide, and the foxglove itself grows in gardens throughout England. What it would require above all is patience. Extraordinary, disciplined, unwavering patience. He rose and reached for his coat. I wished to visit an apothecary in Camberwell. The establishment in question was a modest chemist's shop on Denmark Hill, and the proprietor, a careful man named Wilshaw, proved cooperative when Holmes explained, with selective honesty, that he was investigating a matter of public health concern. "Margaret Melling," Wilshaw confirmed, consulting his ledger. "Yes, she purchases foxglove preparations regularly, has done for, let me see, approximately 18 months. She mentioned a personal heart condition, palpitations, I believe she said. The preparations are standard, dried leaf for tisane. Nothing unusual in the request." Holmes thanked him with the equanimity of a man hearing precisely what he expected, and we departed into the Camberwell afternoon. 18 months, Holmes said. The purchases began 4 months before the letters she was already preparing. It was the connection between Margaret Melling and her victims that had eluded me. The practical question of how a seamstress in Camberwell could have gained regular, unsuspected access to two physicians whose professional and social worlds were entirely removed from her own. Holmes had perceived the answer before I had fully formulated the question. "Ashgrove's Charitable Clinic," he said, spreading a set of parish records across the Baker Street table with the precision of a general mapping a campaign. "The Bermondsey Free Clinic for Women and Children, established in 1887. Ashgrove founded it, driven, I suspect, by the guilt that pursued him from Stepney. The clinic relied upon volunteer workers for its non-medical operations, cleaning, laundering, preparing bandages, and, note this carefully, Watson, brewing herbal tisanes and simple remedies for distribution to patients and staff alike. And Margaret Melling was among the volunteers. She was. Her name appears in the parish register of St. Jude's, Bermondsey, which coordinated volunteer placements for the clinic. She began her service approximately 20 months ago, 4 months before the foxglove purchases commenced, and 8 months before the first letter was sent. The timeline was precise, deliberate, and devastating in its implications. Margaret had not acted in haste or passion. She had positioned herself first, established her presence, become familiar and invisible within the daily operations of the clinic, and only then begun the twin campaigns of correspondence and administration. "But Hartwell," I said, "his practice is in Whitechapel, not Bermondsey. How did she reach him?" Holmes produced a second document, a register from All Saints Parish, Whitechapel, a charitable sewing circle connected to the parish that served Hartwell's practice. The circle provided mended linens and clothing to the dispensary patients. Margaret Melling joined it approximately 16 months ago, 3 months after establishing herself at the Bermondsey Clinic. Through this connection, she gained access to the dispensary's communal kitchen, where herbal preparations, including digestive tisanes, were made available to the physician and his staff. I sat heavily in my chair. The architecture was complete. Margaret Melling had inserted herself into both men's professional environments through the most unimpeachable of pretexts, charitable service, and had used that access to administer foxglove preparations in doses so modest and so gradually increased that neither man would have noticed anything beyond a slow, seemingly natural decline in cardiac health. She hid in plain sight, I said, behind good works. Behind the one thing no one questions, Holmes corrected, kindness offered freely to those who do not deserve it. Holmes stood before the fireplace that evening with the case spread across the mantelpiece in a series of notes, documents, and timeline entries that together formed a diagram of extraordinary criminal patience. The firelight caught the angles of his face as he spoke, and I was reminded, not for the first time, that Holmes's gift was not merely the perception of details, but the ability to assemble them into a coherent narrative that revealed the logic governing apparently disconnected events. Let me present the complete architecture, Watson, so that we may both see it clearly and understand what we are confronting. He touched each note in sequence as he spoke. 20 months ago, Margaret Melling begins volunteer work at Ashgrove's Bermondsey Clinic. She becomes a familiar, trusted presence, a quiet, diligent woman performing humble tasks. 4 months later, she begins purchasing foxglove preparations from the Camberwell apothecary, ostensibly for personal use. Simultaneously, she joins the parish sewing circle connected to Hartwell's Whitechapel dispensary, gaining access to a second point of administration. 8 months after her initial placement, the letters begin. Cream-colored stationery, lavender-scented, containing specific factual details of Clara Melling's treatment and death. 1 letter per month, delivered to both Ashgrove and Hartwell. No threats, no demands, only the relentless reiteration of what happened. A mirror held up, month after month, to the faces of 2 men who had spent 15 years avoiding their own reflections. The letters serve a dual purpose. They maintain psychological pressure, ensuring that guilt remains active and corrosive, and they provide a plausible explanation for any physical decline the recipients might experience. A man receiving anonymous letters detailing his worst secret will naturally exhibit symptoms of stress, sleeplessness, anxiety, cardiac strain. If he then dies of heart failure, the letters provide an alternative narrative that obscures the chemical one. 3 days before Ashgrove's death, Margaret visits him in person, the woman Mrs. Calder described. This visit serves as the final letter, delivered face to face. I know who you are. I know what you did. And I have been beside you, unseen, for longer than you can imagine. Holmes paused and regarded the assembled evidence with an expression I had rarely seen him wear. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but something closer to solemn recognition. It is the most patient crime I have ever encountered, Watson. A murder that took 15 years to conceive and 14 months to execute, and it was conducted with a discipline and precision that I confess I find both horrifying and, I say this with full awareness of its moral complexity, remarkable. Holmes's admission. Holmes paused in his reconstruction and set down his pipe upon the mantelpiece with a deliberateness that signaled not the conclusion of his analysis, but the arrival of something he found difficult to articulate, a rare occurrence for a man whose facility with language was exceeded only by his facility with observation. I have solved the case, Watson, he said. The mechanism, the motive, the identity, the method, all are clear to me. I could present this reconstruction to any intelligent person, and they would recognize its internal coherence, its logical necessity, its explanatory power. He turned from the fireplace and met my gaze, and this knowledge is entirely useless. The word fell into the quiet room with the weight of a verdict. Both men are dead and beyond the reach of earthly justice. The perpetrator has committed no provable crime. The digitalis is untraceable in post-mortem, the letters contain no explicit threat, and the charitable volunteer work provides an unimpeachable cover for her proximity. No court in England would convict on the evidence I possess. No magistrate would issue a warrant. He moved to the window and looked out over Baker Street, his reflection a pale ghost in the darkened glass. I have arrived at the truth, Watson, the way one arrives at a ruin. Too late to prevent the destruction, only to understand what once stood and why it fell. My method assumes the detective arrives in time. This case has taught me that some architectures are completed long before anyone thinks to look. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything his method could achieve and everything it could not. Watson's response. I did not offer platitudes. Long years at Holmes's side had taught me that his mind rejected false comfort as instinctively as his body rejected impure chemicals, and that the surest way to diminish a genuine moment of reflection was to smother it beneath reassurance it had not requested. Instead, I considered his words with the seriousness they deserved, and when I spoke not as the faithful chronicler offering encouragement to the brilliant detective, but as one man addressing another in the presence of a shared limitation. Understanding may be its own form of justice, Holmes, I said. Not the justice of courts or punishment, I grant you that is lost, but a different kind. The kind that restores the name of a child who was erased from the record by two men more concerned with their careers than with her life. Holmes turned from the window. Clara Melling, he said, 7 years old, a congenital heart weakness that was manageable, and a physician's error that was not. You are suggesting that by knowing her story, by reconstructing it fully and accurately, we have given her death a witness it was denied for 15 years. I am suggesting that naming what happened even privately, even between the two of us in this room, is not nothing. Holmes regarded me for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Not the dissolution of his somber mood, but its transformation into something warmer and more bearable. You may be the more philosophical of the two of us, Watson, he said quietly, and I do not say that lightly. Chapter 8. The Confrontation That Wasn't. We returned to Cold Harbor Lane on a morning that offered neither sunshine nor storm, merely the flat, gray persistence of a London sky that had exhausted its capacity for drama and settled into neutrality. It seemed appropriate. The confrontation we were about to undertake, if confrontation was even the correct word for what Holmes intended, would not be theatrical. There would be no dramatic unmasking, no moment of triumph, no criminal brought to bay. There would be only two men and a woman in a small room, and the truth lying between them like a body none of them could move. Holmes had said little during the cab ride from Baker Street. His silence was not the productive silence of a mind at work, but the quieter silence of a mind that had completed its work and was now reckoning with the implications. I did not intrude upon it. There are silences between friends that serve a purpose no conversation can fulfill, and this was one of them. Margaret Melling opened the door without surprise. She looked at Holmes with the same steady, watchful gaze I remembered from our first visit, and I understood in that moment that she had been expecting us, not with anxiety, but with the calm anticipation of a woman who had accounted for every variable in her design, including the variable of Sherlock Holmes. "You have come back, Mr. Holmes," she said. It was not a question. "I have, Mrs. Melling." Holmes's voice carried neither accusation nor gentleness, only a measured clarity that afforded her the respect of directness. "I know what you have done, the letters, the foxglove, the volunteer positions at the Bermondsey Clinic and the Whitechapel Dispensary, the 14 months of careful, invisible administration, the personal visit to Dr. Ashgrove 3 nights before his death, the final letter left beside Dr. Hartwell's body." She listened without flinching. She did not pale, did not tremble, did not reach for a chair or clutch at the doorframe. She stood in the narrow hallway of her Camberwell lodgings, and received the full weight of Holmes's reconstruction with the composure of a woman for whom this moment was not a crisis, but a conclusion. "Have you come to arrest me?" she asked, "or to understand me?" Holmes held her gaze. "May we come in?" She stepped aside. We entered. Margaret's account. She did not sit in the manner of an accused person preparing a defense. She sat as she had before, straight-backed in her plain chair, hands folded in her lap, eyes steady. And when she spoke, it was not of revenge, but of remembrance. "After Clara died," she began, her voice carrying the even cadence of a narrative rehearsed not for performance, but for preservation. A story told and retold in the private chambers of a solitary mind until every word had been polished to its essential truth. "I accepted what the doctor told me. Heart failure, a congenital weakness, God's will," the vicar said. "These things happen," the neighbors said. "I buried my daughter in Stepney churchyard and I tried to believe them." She paused, but it was the pause of a woman organizing her thoughts, not struggling with her emotions. The emotions had been organized long ago. It was 7 years later, 7 years, that I learned the truth. A nurse who had worked at the practice, a woman named Bridget Cooley, fell ill. I visited her in the parish hospital. She was dying, and the dying sometimes unburden themselves of things the living cannot bear to carry. She told me about the dosage, the error, the certificate that named God's will when it should have named a man's carelessness. "And you believed her?" Holmes asked. "I verified her account. It took me years. I am not a learned woman, Mr. Holmes, but I am a thorough one. I obtained parish records, dispensary logs, treatment registers. I educated myself in the properties of the medications my daughter received. I read every book I could find on cardiac pharmacology. And when I had assembled the facts, all of them, every detail beyond any possibility of doubt, I knew what had been done to Clara, and I knew that no court, no medical board, no authority of any kind would act upon that knowledge after so many years." She looked at Holmes with an expression that was neither defiant nor penitent. "I watched Dr. Ashgrove build a career upon the grave of my daughter. I watched him receive honors, publish papers, open clinics, all of it funded by the reputation he maintained by burying his worst mistake. I watched from Camberwell, from my sewing table, and I waited, not for an opportunity, for a certainty." Her voice did not waver, her hands did not tremble, and I understood, with a chill that was not entirely uncomfortable, that Margaret Melling's account was delivered with the same clinical detachment that had characterized the men who signed her daughter's death away. A mirror, deliberate and precise, and the question of proof. Holmes leaned forward in his chair, his elbows upon his knees, his fingers steepled in that familiar cathedral of thought. But the quality of his attention was different from any I had observed in previous confrontations with the architects of crime. There was no cat-and-mouse calculation, no strategic maneuvering toward a confession that might serve as evidence. There was only the direct, respectful engagement of one formidable intelligence with another. "Mrs. Melling," he said, "I must be candid with you. I cannot prove that you poisoned either Dr. Ashgrove or Dr. Hartwell. The digitalis, if administered as I believe it was, in gradually increasing doses through herbal preparations offered in the course of legitimate volunteer work, would be undetectable in any post-mortem examination. The letters, while psychologically devastating, contain no explicit threat and constitute no legal offense. Your charitable activities provide an irreproachable explanation for your proximity to both men." "Then what is it you wish me to say, Mr. Holmes?" "I wish you to tell me the truth, not for the law's sake. The law is powerless here, for the sake of the truth itself." Margaret Melling regarded him for a long moment, and something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, that they were two people for whom truth held a value independent of its utility. "I reminded them," she said. "Month after month, I reminded them of what they had done. I placed myself within their reach, not to harm them, but to be present, a living memorial to the child they had forgotten. Whether that presence and those reminders contributed to their physical decline, I cannot say. I am a seamstress, Mr. Holmes, not a physician. The ambiguity was deliberate. It was wielded with the skill of a woman who had spent 15 years learning the precise boundary between what could be known and what could be proved, and who now stood upon that boundary with the confidence of one who had chosen her ground long before the battle began. Neither confession nor denial, only the impenetrable calm of a woman who had finished her work. Section 4. Holmes withdraws. Holmes rose from his chair. The movement was deliberate, unhurried, and carried with it the finality of a man who had reached the limit of what his profession could accomplish in this room and understood that to remain longer would be to pretend otherwise. "I will not go to the police, Mrs. Melling," he said. His voice held neither approval nor absolution, only the steady acknowledgement of a reality that admitted no satisfying resolution. "Not because I condone what you have done. I neither condone nor condemn it, for I find that my moral faculties, usually reliable, fail to provide a clear verdict. But because the law has no category for what has occurred here. There is no statute that addresses a crime committed through patience, memory, and lavender. She received this without visible relief, as one receives information already known. I will, however, offer you a warning," Holmes continued. "Justice pursued through private channels always exacts a price from the pursuer. Whatever satisfaction you have drawn from this enterprise, its completion will leave you not liberated, but emptied. The purpose that sustained you for 15 years is finished. What remains will require a different kind of courage." Margaret Melling looked at him with the first unguarded expression I had seen on her face. Not vulnerability exactly, but the brief, undefended acknowledgement that his words had reached something the rest of the conversation had not. "I paid my price 15 years ago, Mr. Holmes," she said quietly, "in a small coffin carried through the rain." Holmes inclined his head. There was nothing more to say. We descended the narrow staircase and emerged into Cold Harbor Lane, where the gray Camberwell streets continued their patient, unremarkable business, indifferent to all that had passed within the walls we left behind. Chapter 9. The Reckoning at Baker Street. Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street the following afternoon with the brisk, untroubled air of a man tying off the final threads of a straightforward matter. He settled into the basket chair, accepted tea from Mrs. Hudson, and consulted his notebook with the satisfaction of a craftsman reviewing completed work. "I've come for your opinion on the Ashgrove and Hartwell business, Holmes," he said. "The coroner's findings are in. Natural causes in both instances. Cardiac failure, consistent with professional strain and underlying arterial disease. 2 physicians who neglected their own health while tending to everyone else's. Tragic, but hardly uncommon. I'm closing both files unless you can give me reason to do otherwise." Holmes stood at the mantelpiece, one arm resting upon it, his expression unreadable. "I see no reason to keep them open, Lestrade," he said. Both men suffered from long-standing cardiac conditions exacerbated by professional stress and private anxiety. Dr. Ashgrove had been receiving anonymous correspondence that caused him considerable distress, the product, I believe, of a former patient's family pursuing a grievance through inappropriate channels. Dr. Hartwell's decline was accelerated by alcoholism and the general deterioration of his practice. The convergence of their deaths is a coincidence rooted in shared history and shared temperament, nothing more. Lestrade nodded, closed his notebook, and departed with the relieved efficiency of a man whose instincts had been confirmed by the one person whose contradicting opinion he secretly feared. When the door closed and his footsteps had retreated down the stairs, the silence in the sitting room acquired a different quality. The silence of a room in which something had been deliberately left unsaid, and both its occupants knew it. Holmes, I said carefully, you just lied to a police inspector. He turned from the mantelpiece and regarded me with an expression that was neither defensive nor ashamed, but carried the weight of a man who had chosen between unsatisfactory alternatives and accepted the cost of his choice. I told the truth, Watson, he replied, merely an incomplete version of it. Both men did suffer from cardiac conditions. Both were under considerable stress. The coroner's findings are technically accurate. I have simply omitted the agent that transformed chronic illness into death. And the distinction between omission and falsehood is precisely what troubles me, Holmes said quietly, and I suspect it will trouble me for some time. Watson challenges Holmes. I press the matter, not from self-righteousness, but from the genuine moral disquiet of a man who respected Holmes's judgment and feared in this instance that it had been compromised by something more complex than error. Two men are dead, Holmes. Whether the instrument was digitalis or psychological torment or some combination of both, Margaret Melling orchestrated their destruction. She spent 14 months systematically dismantling two lives. The law may be unable to prosecute, but you are not the law. You are a private citizen who has withheld material information from a police inquiry. That is not a philosophical abstraction. It is a choice, and it carries consequences. Holmes listened with a patience that was itself remarkable. In years past, he might have dismissed my objection with a cutting remark about the limitations of conventional morality. But something in this case, in the long patience of Margaret Melling's grief, in the blotter inscription of a dead man's guilt, in the lavender scent that lingered over two sealed rooms, had altered the calibration of his response. "You are correct, Watson," he said. "In principle, entirely correct. I have no right to adjudicate this matter unilaterally. The decision of what constitutes justice is not mine to make." He paused. "And yet I ask you to consider what justice the law offered Clara Melling in 1880. A 7-year-old child was killed by a physician's negligence. The death was concealed by a fraudulent certificate. The responsible parties suffered no consequence whatever. One built a distinguished career, the other merely declined into drink and obscurity, and the mother, the one person with standing to demand accountability, was told by every authority, every institution, every colleague, that God's will had been done and the matter was closed." His voice remained level, but I heard beneath it a current of something I had rarely encountered in Sherlock Holmes. Not anger, exactly, but a recognition that the systems he served were capable of failures as profound and as damaging as any crime they were designed to prevent. "The silence of 15 years, he said, was not Margaret Melling's silence. It was ours. The weight of being right." Holmes moved to the window, that familiar station of reflection where I had watched him stand 1,000 times, his tall figure silhouetted against the shifting light of Baker Street, his mind engaged with problems that ranged from the trivially criminal to the profoundly human. But his posture this evening carried a weight I had not previously observed, and when he spoke, his voice held the quietness of a man addressing not an audience, but himself. "This case will trouble me, Watson, not because I failed to solve it. The solution is complete, every element accounted for, every mechanism explained. It troubles me because I solved it completely, and it made no difference." He turned the phrase over as though examining it for flaws and finding none. The guilty were already dead before I understood their guilt. The avenger had already completed her design before I perceived its first outlines. The truth, which I have devoted my life to pursuing on the assumption that it possesses inherent power to alter outcomes, served in this instance no living person's interest beyond our own understanding. He placed one hand against the window glass, a gesture so unusual that I noted it with quiet alarm. "My method rests upon a fundamental assumption, that the detective arrives in time, that deduction leads to prevention, that the interval between perceiving a crime and acting upon that perception is narrow enough to permit meaningful intervention. This case has demolished that assumption. Margaret Melling was not merely ahead of me. She had finished before I began. He withdrew his hand and turned back toward the room. Some crimes, Watson, are solved only in retrospect, like translating a language that no one speaks any longer. The grammar is perfect, the vocabulary is precise, and the message arrives in an empty room. I wanted to offer comfort, but recognized that what Holmes required was not comfort but companionship, the simple, sustaining presence of another mind willing to sit with difficulty rather than rush past it toward false resolution. A small act of grace. It was Watson who broke the gravity of that long evening, not with argument or philosophy, but with the simplest of suggestions. "Come, Holmes, let us walk." Holmes agreed, as I had hoped he would. Movement had always served him better than stillness when the weight of a case pressed upon him, and the London streets, with their inexhaustible catalogue of small human dramas, had a restorative quality that no amount of tobacco or solitude could match. As he reached for his coat, I noticed him pause at the writing desk. He drew a sheet of paper toward him, dipped his pen, and wrote several lines in his precise, angular hand. When he folded the note and addressed the envelope, I recognized the name, Mrs. Eleanor Ashgrove, Wimpole Street. "What have you written?" I asked. Holmes hesitated, a rare occurrence, then answered with the candor our long friendship had earned. "I have told her that her husband carried a private burden for many years, a matter of professional conscience that weighed upon him increasingly as he aged. I have told her that the letter she described, the correspondence that so disturbed him, related to this burden, and I have told her that his final terror was not madness or weakness, but the fear of being known, of having the private man revealed behind the public reputation. Is that the truth? It is the most honest, incomplete truth I can offer a widow who deserves more than silence and less than the full weight of what her husband concealed." He sealed the envelope and placed it on the tray for posting. I recognized the gesture for what it was, not a solution, not absolution, but a small act of grace performed within the narrow space between what could be told and what could be borne. It was perhaps the most human thing I had ever seen Holmes do. Chapter 10. The child deserved better. Some weeks have passed since the conclusion of the affair I have titled, after long deliberation, "The Case Holmes Solved Too Late." I write these final pages not at Baker Street but at my own desk in Paddington, where the distance of both time and geography affords me a perspective that proximity denied. I have found this narrative uncommonly difficult to compose, not because the facts resist ordering, for Holmes laid them out with his customary precision, but because the moral landscape of the case resists the simplification that narrative demands. I am accustomed to recording adventures in which the boundary between right and wrong, however obscured by complexity, ultimately reveals itself with clarity. In this matter, that boundary remains elusive, and I confess I am not certain it exists. I think of Margaret Melling in her Camberwell lodgings, the campaign complete, the letters ceased, the volunteer work concluded. The cream-colored stationery sits unused upon her writing desk. The lavender oil gathers dust. The purpose that animated 15 years of patience and 14 months of meticulous execution has been fulfilled. And what remains, as Holmes warned her, is the emptiness that follows completed vengeance, which is indistinguishable from the emptiness that preceded it, except that it no longer carries the consolation of intent. I think of Clara Melling, a child I never knew and never shall, whose 7 years of life set in motion a mechanism that outlasted her by twice her span upon this earth. She has become, in my mind, not a victim or a cause or a justification, but simply a child who was ill and who trusted the adults charged with her care, and who died because one of those adults was tired and made an error and another was afraid and signed a lie. I think of the two physicians, one celebrated, one ruined, united in death as they were united in guilt, and of the long silence they maintained not out of malice, but out of the ordinary human inability to face the worst thing one has done. And I write, with the honesty this account demands, that some cases do not end with justice or injustice, but with the quiet, irreversible recognition that time moves only forward and carries with it, equally indifferently, without appeal, the guilty and the innocent alike. Holmes at the grave. There is one further incident I must record, though I witnessed it by accident and Holmes does not know I observed it. I include it not to expose a private moment, but to complete the portrait of this case and of the man who solved it, for without this incident, the record would present the detective's mind, but not his conscience, and the two are not so separate as Holmes himself would have us believe. It was a Thursday afternoon, gray and mild, some 10 days after our final visit to Camberwell. I had occasion to travel to Stepney on a medical matter. A colleague at the London hospital had requested a consultation, and my route took me past a small churchyard set back from the commercial road behind a low stone wall. I saw Holmes before he saw me. He stood before a modest headstone in the older section of the burial ground, his tall figure unmistakable even at a distance, his hands clasped behind his back in that characteristic posture of contemplation. He wore no hat, despite the chill, and his dark coat stood in stark contrast to the weathered stones surrounding him. I did not approach, I did not call out or make my presence known. I stood behind the wall and watched as Sherlock Holmes, the most rigorously rational man I have ever known, the man who professed indifference to sentiment and proclaimed the supremacy of logic over all softer faculties, stood in silence before the grave of a 7-year-old girl he had never met, whose death he had uncovered 15 years after the fact, and whose name had become, in the private geography of his conscience, a landmark he could not pass without acknowledgement. He remained for several minutes. He did not bow his head or speak, or make any gesture that might be interpreted as mourning. He simply stood, present and attentive, offering to a forgotten grave the one thing it had been denied for 15 years, the attention of someone who understood what had happened there and refused to look away. I continued on my way to the London hospital and said nothing of what I had seen. Some observations are too important to share and too significant to forget. The final line. I have deliberated at length over the title of this narrative, for a title is not merely a label but a lens through which the reader perceives everything that follows, and I wished this lens to be honest rather than sensational. Holmes solved the case. Let that be stated without qualification or diminishment. He identified the original crime, the negligent death of Clara Melling, and its concealment through a fraudulent certificate. He identified the perpetrator of the subsequent deaths, Margaret Melling, who spent 15 years preparing and 14 months executing a campaign of retribution so disciplined and so precisely calibrated that it left no legally actionable evidence in its wake. He identified the method, chronic digitalis administration through charitable volunteer access, and the psychological mechanism, the cream-colored letters that ensured guilt remained active and corrosive. He identified every element, explained every connection, and reconstructed the complete architecture of a crime that spanned a decade and a half. And none of it mattered. Not because the solution was wrong, but because it was late. Not late by hours or days, the margin within which most cases are won or lost, but by 15 years. The original crime was committed in 1880. Holmes encountered its consequences in 1895. By the time his extraordinary mind engaged with the problem, every significant act had already been completed, every consequence already set in motion, every participant already beyond the reach of intervention. The case was solved too late, and the greatest mystery, the one that lingers with me still as I set down my pen, was never who killed whom or how or why. The greatest mystery was simply this: why did it take so long for anyone to look? Baker Street, evening. I returned to Baker Street on the evening I completed this manuscript, carrying the pages in my medical bag alongside the stethoscope and the prescription pad, the instruments of my two vocations resting side by side, as they had for so many years. Holmes was in his chair when I arrived, the violin resting across his knee. He had been playing, not the melancholy, discordant improvisations that signaled his darker moods, but something measured and resolute, a piece I did not recognize, composed perhaps by Holmes himself in the private workshop of his musical imagination. It was not sad. It was considered the sound of a mind that had passed through difficulty and emerged not unchanged, but unbroken. He set the instrument aside as I entered, but did not speak. I settled into my own chair, opened a medical journal upon my lap, and did not read it. The fire crackled in the grate. London murmured beyond the window, that great, indifferent, magnificent city that contained within its streets 10,000 stories of grief and grace and quiet endurance, most of which would never be recorded by anyone. We sat in silence, Holmes and I, as we had sat 1,000 times before, and would sit, I hoped, 1,000 times again. The silence was not empty. It held within it everything the case had taught us and everything it had cost us, and it held, most gently of all, the shape of a small girl's name, spoken by no one in that room, but present nonetheless, like lavender on the evening air.